It's lovely to be talking to you all. I'm just a little sad that I don't get to come to the beautiful Dales to do so. You know, I'm doing this from Leeds. I'd much rather be doing it from some of the lovely places that you guys are. The best I can manage is my water is contained in a sort of Dales-like cup. It's at least got sheep on. So the plan for this evening is to share a little bit about what the Dialect and Heritage Project has been doing. That's the project that I head up at the University of Leeds, but we also work in partnership with 5 museums, one of which is located in the Dales Countryside Museum. So more about that later. You'll see that I've put up a little selection of some of the fantastic photographs that we've got in our collection, and we'll revisit some of them a little bit later as well. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the sorts of work we've been doing in the present day, but also give you the opportunity to hear some of the historical stuff that we have in archives at Leeds that we're now sharing back with the communities, and in my view, that's absolutely where they belong. So there will be some audio recordings, and we have tested them, so crossed fingers that all that works too. I see that we've got people from all different places. We've got people transatlantic too, some of whom, like me, are of Cumdens. That's a word I adopted when I moved to Yorkshire at first, and as you will hear from my accent, I am very clearly not a Yorkshire woman. So I imagine that there may well be many people in the room who know a lot more about Yorkshire dialect than I do. So I'm sure I'm going to get a bit of an education as well. So without more ado, let's see if I can make everything work. So a very brief kind of historical overview as to how we got to where we got to. And some of you will be aware of the history of this, and some of you may not. So if you know all this already, please just indulge me. But I think it's quite important because it explains both the heritage of dialect study at the University of Leeds, but it also explains why we've got these particularly rich resources that we are now sharing back with local communities. So we go right back to 1946 and to Harold Orton, who's at the top of my timeline here. We actually go back slightly before 1946. There had been discussions between Harold Orton. In 1946, he became the Professor of English Language and Medieval Literature at the University of Leeds. He came to Leeds from Sheffield, and before that, he was based up at Armstrong College. And now my slide's going to jump, you see, never trust the technology. And he and his friend and colleague Eugen Diet, who was based in Switzerland, they sat down to devise what is now the world famous survey of English dialects. It's something that in my world is still considered the reference point. It was a very, very big survey, and I'll share some details of that with you in a minute. But one of the reasons why they did it was they'd been talking about it before the Second World War broke out. And then, of course, circumstances overtook them, and they had to wait until the end of the war before they could get this going again. But they were particularly concerned to collect dialect before it was changed, as they saw it, potentially forever. So they were acutely aware that people were starting to move around the country more. They were more socially mobile, more geographically mobile, more socioeconomically mobile. And so they were quite concerned that what they were especially interested in, which was traditional dialect, and that affected the methodology that they used for their survey. They were particularly concerned that that was going to change forever, and in some parts, perhaps some of it be lost forever. So they sat down in 1946 to devise the Survey of English Dialects. It was a massive project, and the field work really began in 1950 and ran through to 1961. But the publications followed on quite a bit behind that. So basically they had 9 intrepid field workers. Depending how you count it, you can sometimes get to 11, but there were 9 main field workers who travelled right across England. It was a survey of English dialects in England. They did a bit of Wales as well, but mainly in England. And they went to 313 different locations. And so they did visit places in the Dales, along with places elsewhere in the country. And when they got there, they asked some 1,300 questions. So it was absolutely massive. And so if you do the arithmetic, just based on the survey alone, and the recordings came later, you've got kind of 400,000 data points or 400,000 answers to questions. So it was a very, very large scale survey. And as I say, you know, it took about 11 years to do the main body of the fieldwork. And the publications came along later. So there were, eventually there were atlases. That was what Howard Orton was particularly interested in producing, a linguistic atlas. At the time, these had been produced on the continent, but they hadn't really been produced here. People in Scotland were starting to do the same sort of thing. So, you know, there was quite a lot of a kind of busyness around this sort of period in terms of interest in dialect. And there was a matching interest at the start of the 60s with what we might term, it's not a term I particularly like, but vernacular culture. So museums like the Dales Countryside Museum that celebrate the lives and the objects and, you know, the kind of traditions of just, you know, ordinary everyday people and you know how they worked and how they lived in their kind of local villages and in the landscape. So there was a real kind of interest at the time in terms of looking towards traditional dialect and looking towards traditional ways of life. We then moved to the 1960s, and the chap in the photograph here for the Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies, which was also based at Leeds, and it grew out of the kind of centre of expertise they built up around the survey of English dialects. The Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies continued work on dialect, but expanded further into what we might term folklife studies at the University of Leeds. So very much this, you know, what were people's traditions, what were their beliefs, what were their games, you know, how did they live their lives? And so Orton was instrumental in setting it up, but Stuart Sanderson was the director. And that work continued until the early 1980s, at which point, if you like me remember it, there were quite a lot of cuts in higher education, and unfortunately the institute was closed down. However, that said, all of the materials from the Survey of English Dialects and the Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies, well, they were sitting around various cupboards in the School of English, and I think some of them might have been heading towards the skip. You know, that's the kind of world, sometimes the risky world you deal with when you're dealing with this type of material. But its importance was recognised, thankfully. And so these materials were rounded up and rescued and put for safekeeping into their new permanent home in the university's Brotherton Library in the rather splendid looking Parkinson Tower building. And they form part of the special collections there. So these materials were collected up, they were catalogued, and they were very much, you know, preserved for future study and for future generations. It was, of course, possible to make an appointment to go and visit this material. You didn't have to be a student at the university or a member of the staff at the university to go and visit it. But I think it would be fair to say that not everybody has the opportunity to go to a university library. You know, it might be too far to travel, it might just not be feasible. And so it seemed a bit of a pity that these riches, this wealth of riches was sitting very well preserved and looked after, but not that many people people were looking at it. I came across the Leeds Archive of Vernacular Culture when I joined the University of Leeds some 20 years ago, and I was taken to special collections, and people had explained to me what this stuff was and why it was so important. And basically, if you've ever been to one of these big libraries, research library, or just a big public library, you'll perhaps have seen what happens when you go into the stacks, the bit at the back you don't normally get into, and basically, somebody turns the wheel and a whole wall of stuff comes towards you. Well, that was the experience that I had. There was just kind of wall of boxes came, and I started digging in these boxes and thought, wow, this stuff is just amazing. But to me, it really deserves to go back to the communities that it came from. It has a particular type of intellectual interest, if you like, in a university library, but actually, because it records and documents and celebrates, voices from the past and just people's ways of life, and real people, who have descendants, who have families, then for me, it seemed a crying shame that it was in the university library and not known or available out there in the community. And so that's why I applied to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we were very grateful to get funding for them. So without them, there would be no project. We supplemented that with some very helpful funding from Leeds University alumni, and we worked with our 5 museum partners to bring this unique material, and in many cases very, very moving, very rich material, to the nation. And so if you're wondering what the strange picture is at the bottom, this is when we launched the project, and this is yours truly trying to look not too terrified, sitting on the BBC breakfast sofa live with, I think it's Naga and Charlie, that one. I don't know, I've done 2 gigs on that. It might be Naga and John. But we've been very fortunate that lots of people were interested and have supported the project. So that's the kind of plotted timeline. What sort of stuff was it that I got so excited about? Why did I think that this stuff really mattered? Well, the not terribly snappily titled Leeds Archive of Vernacular Culture, that's what they called it when they kind of gathered it all up in the early 2000s. It's in 2 main parts. So it contains materials from the Survey of English Dialects, and now my slide's going to jump again, materials from the Survey of English Dialects, and materials from the Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies. I've already said a little bit about the Survey of English Dialects, and I'll show you a map in just a minute. But the Institute, it wasn't necessarily, running a huge survey the way that the Survey of English Dialects was. It had lots of individual pieces of research that were done either by members of staff, by visiting scholars, by students at the University of Leeds. And so it's very, very rich in a huge range of things, from maple traditions to clog dancing to traditional trades. I mean, you name it, witches, stones, there's all sorts of fantastic stuff in there. But considered together as a whole, what have we got? Well, we've got 2,000 plus photographs. We've got 900 plus audio recordings, and we'll hear some of them in just a moment. We've got all the answers to the Survey of English Dialects, 1,300 questions. We've got word and pronunciation and grammar maps, and again, I'll show you some of those. We've got the original field workers' notebooks, and when we get to those, I'll explain how they did it, because it's very different from the way you would do it nowadays. And we've got a whole host of other stuff. So we've got newspaper cuttings, we've got the rather esoterically entitled Folklife file, which is just a panoply of riches. And we've got, maybe 220 plus specialist studies on all different things to do with domestic and rural life. So I've just given you a few examples there. That, cheese making, we'll touch on that. Farming, we'll touch on that this evening as well. And pace eggs. I mean, I'd never heard of pace eggs until I came to Yorkshire, but lots and lots of kind of really rich and fascinating resources. some of you may know some of the history of some of that, but I suspect you haven't met this lady here. So this is Nan Livesey, and she's part of the untold story of the Survey of English Dialect. So, you know, in my world where people are writing about dialect and they're thinking about how you collect it, you know, do you survey people and thinking about the kind of methodology, if you like. Lots has been written about how they actually did the survey, and I will give you the kind of the shortened version of that in just a minute. But because it was such a huge survey, Hallowed Orton rather cannily used some of his students to test out the survey questions and how they were going to ask it before he actually got all these field workers together and sent them out into the community. And so Nan was one of Hallowed Orton's students back in 1947. So she was one of the first people he taught at the University of Leeds. And she did her study, and that's what she's got open in front of her. That's her thesis, her MA thesis. She was working on the dialect of Budworth, which was her home village in North Yorkshire. Her friend, Mabel, I don't have a picture of Mabel, but I do have a picture that represents what Mabel did. This was in the days when I guess fieldwork at universities was conducted rather differently from what it might be nowadays. And Mabel was very interested in the dialect used by fishermen. And she was looking at fishermen who were fishing off the coast near Staithes, so up near Whitby. If you want to collect the dialect of fishermen, well, she'd quite a clever plan. Fishermen were, you know, they're very, very busy people. The way she was able to collect the dialect was she went out with them in the boats, and they went out fishing at night. So basically, she went out with them at night, and she sat in the dark for hours. They put the nets down, and while the nets were down and waiting to be filled with fish, that's when she asked them about their dialect. I guess they were all kind of captive audience on the boat. And so that's how she did her fieldwork. She did her fieldwork sitting in the dark, in the middle of the night, in a cold boat, in the middle of the sea. I certainly don't send my students out to do fieldwork that way today, but so these are the kind of, you know, really interesting human stories, I think, that sometimes don't get told. And one of the things that's been lovely about the Dialect and Heritage Project is that we've been able to uncover some of those and meet some of the original people. And for me, I find that really exciting to get that kind of first-hand account. So the field workers for the Survey of English Dialects, as I've suggested, they went out and about in the linguistic landscape, and they went to, as I've already suggested, 313 different locations. They did do a little bit of work in cities, so there was a little bit done in York and Leeds and Sheffield, and a tiny bit done in London. But really, they were interested in going to rural places. And if you look at the map, all the little dots are the places that they visited. And you can see that they had quite a cunning plan. So they spaced things out so that, you know, you have a good representation of the breadth of dialect across the different areas of the country. But they also were quite careful to make sure that they were visiting places where they hoped that the dialect hadn't been changed too much. So those of you who are interested in such matters will probably know that you know, lots of people are interested in where things like the natural landscape might create natural barriers. You know, do mountains block things? Do rivers mean things are carried? What about you know, just the kind of physicality of the place? How does that affect things? And they were particularly interested in traditional forms of dialect. So they were wanting older forms that they thought were more likely to be preserved in rural places. They were interested in dialect, particularly as a window on the past. So nowadays people often think of dialect in terms of, you know, the way that people speak in Yorkshire. Some of the words they use, you know, the accents and so on are very different from, for example, Newcastle or the Midlands. And we think more in terms of variety, but variety at the same point in time. Well, what they were interested in was particularly not just variety, but variety in dialect as a way of looking back to language as it was in the past, because often you get things preserved in dialect that then are lost in other varieties of the language. So this is where you can do a bit of spotting to see if there's a village, you know, near where you're interested in. But these are the locations that they went to in North Yorkshire. So they went to places like Melsonby and Stokesley and Dent, Mooker, Askrigg, Bedale, Borbley, Helmsley, Grassington, Pateley Bridge, Gargrave, Spofford, and so on. So they went to, you know, quite a variety of places, and they were very careful to pick places that weren't too big. If there's a little R after that, that means that we've got an audio recording, and I'll explain more about them in a minute. Overlaid on the map are the 5 museums that are the partner museums for the Dialect and Heritage Project. So I've already alluded to the Dales Countryside Museum in Hawes. There's the Ryedale Folk Museum further up in the North York Moors at Hutton Le Hole. And as you can see, there are other museums spread across the country. Cunningly spread across the country, because we wanted to work with museums that had access into different communities and where we might be working with different dialects. So the SED field workers, who were these people that went out? Remember I said there were kind of 9 main field workers. Well, the ones who did Yorkshire were really 2 field workers. So there was Peter Wright, who was the very earliest field worker. And so they had quite a smart plan in that they started off closer to home. So they started off with Yorkshire and then they kind of moved out across the country. And so Peter Wright kicks them off and deals with 37 localities, mainly Yorkshire is his focus. And then later on, Stanley Ellis, who, as you can see, was the most productive of all of the field workers. He works all over the country, but he also, as part of that, is doing some work in Yorkshire. And he was with the survey for a long, long time, and he was with the School of English at the University of Leeds for longer still. I only met Stanley Ellis once, very, very briefly, but I have had very helpful accounts from his children, and they've been very generous in sharing some of the stories of how this was done. But I've also had the privilege of interviewing 2 of them. So Donald Sykes, who's the chap in the top right, he did the West Midlands, so sort of towards the kind of Welsh Marches area. And then Michael Barry, who did the southeastern counties, the Isle of Man, and actually he edited the work that Donald had done. So there's a real kind of people connection here too. But Stanley Ellis is the chap here on the left of the photograph, our most prolific field worker. And he's standing there interviewing a chap called Tom Mason. And Tom Mason is standing outside his house in Addingham Moorside. If you were paying attention at the map, you might have noticed that that didn't appear on the list of locations. And it's because this is not quite the photograph it appears to be. So it is a photograph of it was staged basically for when they did the big publicity push, when they were, you know, telling people that they were doing the survey and they had the publications coming out. It so happened that Tom Mason and Stanley Ellis were friends, and I guess Tom Mason had the right kind of house, and if you put them in the right kind of outfit, I guess he looked quite like a lot of the informants. We'll meet some of the informants in just a minute, but this is a photograph that to some extent lies. If you look on the left-hand side, you will see some of the massive equipment. You know, they were using these large reel-to-reel recorders, but the photograph itself is a bit of a con, but you only know that if you actually ask people. And so that's one of the things that's been really exciting. We've been able to actually get personal accounts. So the field workers were sent out Of course, nowadays, if I was going to do that, I certainly wouldn't be able to send my students out to sit in a boat in the middle of the night, but they'd be able to stay in touch. You know, they've all got mobile phones. They'd be able to use that kind of equipment, very portable equipment for their recordings. You know, this was not the world in the 1950s, obviously. And so they were tasked with, when they got to a location, and basically they were sent out with a map, told where they'd to go to scout the place out. They usually didn't have any accommodation booked. You know, they weren't staying in swanky hotels. Usually what they would do is turn up at the local post office in the days when we had lots and lots of post offices, and they would ask the postmaster or the postmistress, you know, who are the people who have lived in the village for a long time. Ideally, they wanted people who hadn't moved around too much. They wanted older speakers, and we will meet some of them in a minute. And they would also say, oh, and by the way, is there anybody that can put us up for, you know, the next week? We need somewhere to stay. And apparently the Ordnance Survey people had been round a few years before, and they had also asked for people to stay. So this didn't seem quite as outlandish a practice as it might seem to us today. And so they were also tasked with writing back to Harold at base camp in Leeds to say that they'd got there. And so Donald came up to the university and he was quite surprised to see that we still had lots and lots of the correspondence that he'd sent back from the field to Harold Orton. And so this is one such example. And so he's arrived at this job in Edgemont, and he can see that everything's going really well. I'm settled above address. I should be very comfortable. An enormous list of possible informants, so that's good. So clearly the postmistress has been doing her job. Seems quite promising. Everyone has been most friendly so far, so I hope the work goes as well. And he finishes it off with a little quip. An interesting point is that my arrival has coincided with the arrival of the sewage pipe from Newport, an event of which I hope is not an omen. So, you know, he was out in the field and back at base camp. This is Harold Orton here, as you will recognise. And here are the people in the editing room who were collecting all the stuff that came back. Donald Sykes travelled by motorbike. The department bought a Bantam. There were other field workers who had different modes of transport, most notably Stanley Ellis, who you met just a little moment ago in the mock photograph. Stanley Ellis borrowed the departmental Land Rover, and he actually had a caravan. He got married quite early in his fieldwork career, and so he took his wife and young son, and they travelled around the countryside in a caravan. That was more convenient for them, and they would set up camp in farmers' fields. And there are all sorts of wonderful stories about, you know, where they hung the washing, and you know, things like they had their own portable electric fence so that, you know, the cows didn't get in and eat the washing and that kind of thing. So this is how they stayed in touch. So very different from the world we inhabit nowadays. The survey itself, as I've already alluded to, was very, very long. There were 1,300 questions. They tended to ask questions primarily of men. We do have women in the survey. And I'm afraid, ladies, that we got asked the questions about housekeeping. So we got asked questions about baking. We got asked questions about cleaning, doing the laundry, you know, and possibly childhood illnesses. Those sorts of questions were the women questions. So again, it's a very different world. And you can see I've pulled this up. This is from the printed version of the questions, but they're asking, you know, what do you make your white bread out of? And there you can see it says, you know, flour with an asterisk. What that means is that they were interested in the pronunciation rather than a different lexical variant, a different word. So, you know, is it flour, or is it fleur, or is it some other type of variant that they're looking for? So this is, you know, a flavour of the questions. So they went out with a version of this, and they had a field worker's notebook. So if you look to the right-hand side of the screen, This is what was used by the field workers out in the field to record the answers to the survey questions. So this is a Yorkshire one, and so this is Bill Hewison being interviewed in Beedale. And you can see on the left-hand side, these were the answers to the survey questions. And if you can read the IPA, that's the International Phonetic Alphabet, so it's a special type of alphabet that reflects the pronunciations, that make sense of the fact that, you know, the way I say words and many of you say words will be quite different, whereas that wouldn't be reflected in the spelling. And so you can see that the first one here is the answer flour, and then we've got meal, and then we've got yeast. So down the left-hand side, this is where they wrote all the answers to the survey questions. So basically, they would say, you know, what's your word for a, right? And they were very careful how they asked the question so that they didn't kind of give away the answer, as it were. But recording equipment in those days was incredibly expensive, incredibly unwieldy, and just really not technologically available at the start of the 50s. And so when they started the survey, the field worker had to go out, they had to have a fantastic ear because they had to ask this question and get the answer and write it down using IPA and get it right first time. Because the chances are that if I ask you to repeat it, you might change your pronunciation. And depending on who you are and what the context is, you might become kind of broader dialect, you might be kind of showing off your dialect, or you might you know, become more kind of formalized, and you might become more standardized. So they had to be really, really good at their phonetics. They had to be a fantastic field workers. You'll see that they also drew pictures of things that they encountered. So here is a drawing of a cow byre. And you can see there's a hole for throwing muck into the midden. And I'm afraid there is actually, if you can read the IPA, there is actually a diagram showing where the piss hole is. My apologies for the French, but that's what it says. And so they did record other kind of interesting things, both in terms of pictures, but also down the right-hand side, anything that people said or that they encountered that seemed quite interesting, they would note that down as well. So they got the you know, answers to the survey questions, but they got other stuff too. And so when all this stuff came back, so remember all those people sitting in base camp in Leeds, sifting through all the material, and they would be sifting through to try to identify patterns. And so one of the things they were able to come up with was these word maps, which are essentially a kind of a summary digest of all the response books. So there's one for each of these 313 places. All of those then get mapped so you can start to see patterns and how things are varied across the country. So some of these words I think are still productive today. So, you know, when you pour boiling water onto the leaves, or perhaps nowadays the tea bag, in the teapot or your mug, what is it that you say that you are doing? Well, are you brewing it? Are you mashing it? Are you masking it? Are you soaking it? Are you wetting it? Well, you can see that in the Dales, the majority decisions were somewhere between mash and brew. What do you call those little bits of batter that you might get served alongside what I might call a fish supper, but you might call your fish and chips? So is it scratchings? Is it scraps? Is it bits? So they ask that kind of thing. And also words for a snack. And again, you know, you will recognize words like bait and snap. But you got ones from right across the country like beaver and snack bit, all sorts of really, really interesting words. So this type of thing, you know, we give these maps to people in the present day, and actually quite a lot of people still use these words. So dialect is certainly not dead. These are some of the really early maps. I thought you might like to see, you know, kind of what they were working with. This is, you know, very kind of early stage works. And you can see here that, of course, they're interested in what the word is for a small course of water, what I would call, you know, back in Scotland, a burn, and I can see people up there in the northeast agree. But of course, here in Yorkshire, that we would term it a beck, and then further south you get brook. On the right-hand side, oddly enough, we have words for left-handed. And again, you can see, you know, lots of terms that are related, like, you know, caggy, cuddy, keggy, you know, I have corry fisted, so it's the same kind of thing. All these slightly insulting, it has to be said, words for people who are left-handed. And so again, some people will still use these terms today, we've found. So who were the people that they went to interview? Well, the informants were, as I've suggested, predominantly people from rural communities. They particularly wanted people who had spent little or no time away from their home village, so they didn't want their dialect to have been contaminated, if you like. They were more interested in collecting the language of men because they felt that they were less inclined to correct their speech. And of course, you know, quite a lot of women at the time, if they worked, you know, they either worked on the farm or some of them worked in service. And if you worked in service, then you'd be more likely to modify the way that you spoke. They wanted people who were intelligent, they wanted people who were good talkers for fairly obvious reasons, and they wanted people who had a good set of teeth. Why did their teeth matter? Well, because if you have lost your teeth, or you know, if you have a dental plate, it does actually change your pronunciation. And of course, one of the things they were interested in was the way people pronounced words. So their teeth were quite important. So here we have a selection of people. So we've got Bill Hewison, who we've already seen from the response book. This is the man himself standing outside his house in Ryedale. He worked as a jockey and he started work at the age of 9, pulling turnips. Worked in various stables and farms, a great betting man, apparently. Jack Swales, standing on his pig. Don't ask me why he was standing on his pig. I have no idea. In the garden of his home in Pateley Bridge. And we've got Mr. Thompson standing outside his house in Melsonby. And, you know, he was fairly typical. He'd left school at the age of 12, become a farm boy. His father was from sort of farming, labouring family. His mother was also fairly local. He'd been in farming, he'd been a quarryman. He had gone away, but he had come back quite quickly. So these are the sorts of people that they interviewed. Here again is our friend Stanley Ellis with Tom Mason. You get a better view of the reel-to-reel recorder. Because a few years into the fieldwork, it was more possible to start making audio recordings. And so they got a portable reel-to-reel recorder. It was still huge. And, you know, they had to strap it onto the back of the motorbike. You know, people like Donald, who didn't have the benefit of the Land Rover. And so they started recording. And where they could, they went back to the people who'd originally been interviewed and done the survey. But of course, they were very interested in older people. And so you had to be at least sort of 60, 65 to be interviewed because they wanted people with, you know, traditional forms of the language. So people, some of them that had been born in the 1870s, you know, that's what we're talking. And sometimes these people had passed away. So they weren't always able to go back and get the original people. I've got a few audio recordings. The ones on here are a bit quiet, so I'm not going to play these ones, but just to give you a flavour, we've got Tom from Gargrave talking about his working life, and we've got James Ingleby talking about cheese making, appropriately enough, in Wensleydale. But I think the one in the next slide plays a bit better. We'll come back to cheese in just a minute. So this is, if I can make it go at the top, there we go. This is Charles Armstrong from Stokesley describing doing the milk round.
When I started, I got started with a milk round, you know, and I used to tell it wholesale at first, and then I got started with a retail round. Well, I used to be up at 4:30 every morning that it would come, and I used to milk about, I had 13 cows to milk before I got my breakfast. And milk thing on, wasn't machine milking. And I used to have a little clock stuck on table, you know, down at milk house. And I used to milk with that clock. And if I was 5 minutes late, I knew I had that 5 minutes to back up. Folks used to get up with me, you know, when I used to come to the house with milk.
So yeah, you set the alarm clock by the milkman. Wish my milkman turned up as early as that. And so we've been able often to make links. So we've collected present day dialect recordings or oral history recordings. I don't particularly mind what you call them. We've got people like Cal discussing childhood games. And actually, we've also interviewed one of the little boys in this picture. And we've also been able to make contact with people who who either there were photographs of or audio recordings of, or indeed they were interviewed by the survey back in the 1950s. So there's all sorts of really interesting family and community links. But I'll let the people talk for themselves. They're much more interesting than I am.
And I'll tell you what we did. Yes, we did play in the barns.
Sorry.
And I'll tell you what we did. Yes, we did play in the barns in my friends' houses because the hay was loose there, lovely smell. So, and there'd be a swing in the barn. And we would roller skate in the shippons because that was the only, you think about, there's no flat spaces, no flat areas, smooth flat areas around for roller skating. So in the shippons, when the cows had been taken out and been washed down, we'd roller skate up and down the shippons.
That's certainly a novel place to do roller skating. I didn't have anything like that to do my roller skating. This is Helen talking about her relatives, one of whom was the lady in the picture making cheese.
So my granny at Hilltop Lodge, it's quite a big house. It's got a walled garden and there's 2 cheese presses in a recess in the wall, huge stone cheese presses. And she made cheese, which my great-grandfather then loaded up, and he set up for 3:30 and went up to Barnard Castle with the cheeses to sell. And if it was really bad, he went up to Middleton and Teesdale, and the coal miners would come down from the Durham coalfields to buy it. And my great aunt made cheese as well up at West Stonestill, which I've just been given the photographs for, which is just fabulous because I didn't have that much detail. And her handwritten notes that explain each photograph, what she's doing and why she's doing it. So yeah, just amazing to get after all this time. That's right, yes. And my gran, Louisa Guy, who's featured in the Murray Hartley books, there's a picture of her actually at the stone cheese presses at Hilltop.
So you can see we've been able to make these lovely links and you know, essentially give the community back what I feel really belongs to the community, rather than being hidden away in a university. John Waggett, I'll give you just a little brief snip of him, remembering moving from working with horses and carts to tractors.
I never passed an exam in my life, right? That is true. But I made a living and I'm still here, right? That is true. But no, he worked, but how things is altered in the time, like I can remember one on the truck, everything was going to be horses, right? And started with tractors and we're going from that today.
I think you can hear from the variety of accents and varieties there that there's certainly still quite a lot of variety abroad. So what have we done? Well, we've had our great big dialect hunt running for some time. We're still running that. I'll give you the details at the end. And one of the things that we want to do is very much share our results back. So a lot of the big scale analysis is happening at the moment. Our research assistant is doing all sorts of fantastic stuff, mapping it and analysing it. But just to give you a flavour of the sorts of things that are coming, we asked people for their words for hedgehog. And this was the national picture. This is what came back. But you can see we've got hedge pigs and urchins and hedgies and fuzz pegs and all sorts of, you know, haggy and fuzzy peg, all these fantastic words for hedgehog that people still use or still know. And these, I think, were ones that we developed particularly for the Dales Countryside Museum. You can see that on the left, we asked, you know, if you go out and, you know, it's been kind of raining and, you know, it's a bit muddy, what your shoe is going to get covered in. And you can see that, yes, people know the word mud and use it, but they also talk about clods and clarts and slutch and clods, splange and plother, lots of really kind of fun aesthetic words there as well. They kind of sound like what they are. But, you know, I mean, I don't have clarts as in, you know, mud, but I have clarty meaning muddy or dirty. So a lot of these things are kind of shared beyond England too. And there's a very good historical reason for that. But if the ground is wet or icy, you must take care because the roads are, well, yes, you get slippery and slippy, but you also get slape and skiddy and slick, slake. We've got a few more down there. So you can see, and the nice one about these ones is that these are these are phonesthetic words, so you can play with sl words. That sound seems to have something about slippery movement in it. It's quite a productive one. So you can have endless hours of fun with it, with the dictionary, to see what other ones fit that pattern. For me, you know, sleek it is a kind of metaphorical extension. You know, a person who's a bit slippery, and you can see that somebody there also responded with sleek it. We also ask people, which most surveys don't do, if they've got any other words that they want to share with us. And so here's just a little snapshot of some of the words we've had back. So laking, I think will be quite familiar to people in Yorkshire. But you know, there's other words that like ginnel, there's another one. But obviously, you know, sugally, I've got sugally, but I don't have plodging, and I don't really have mithered, although I've learned mithered since I came here, because I hear colleagues in the school who are from elsewhere in England talking about it. But you can see we've got snickets and ginnels and all sorts of different words. And here are other people giving words. So there's crozzled, there's rammel, there's shunkly, a crate egg, and somebody talking about the use of thee and thou and thy, and whether or not that persists in the present day. So this is the sort of information we've been collecting. And as I say, we're analysing that at the moment. How can you get involved? Well, some of you might have been to see some of the exhibitions that we've put on. We've still got lots of stuff on the website, and we are adding to that as we go along. So there are new stories, and there's new data, and there'll be new audio recordings going up very shortly. So you can explore what we've got, and you can also contribute to our dialect research. So if you just go to the website, you'll see that you can contribute your own dialect words. You can contribute your voice. You can tell us about the words that you use and where they come from. I think it's really important to say that, unlike the Survey of English Dialects, we want to hear from everyone. So I'm certainly not going to ask you all sorts of personal rude questions about the state of your teeth. We're also not only interested in older speakers, we are interested in older speakers, but we're interested in younger speakers too. And we're interested in people, you know, who might have lived in the same place for many generations, but we're also interested in people who may only have arrived in this country in very recent times. So, you know, we're very much aware that the world is a different place. And one of the things we're interested in is, how do people take dialect with them, and how do they adopt different words from other people as they move around the country, make new relationships? You know, why is it that since I came to Yorkshire, I now no longer really, in my head, I'm not translating burn into beck, I just call it a beck. You know, why have I adopted the word off Cumden, but I haven't adopted other Yorkshire words? You know, so there's something interesting there that we're researching too. So there will be more coming soon, and you can also, if you want more stuff, we regularly put stuff out on Twitter, or X as we must call it nowadays, or you can sign up to receive our newsletter. So we've still got lots and lots to find out. You can still take part. We very much would like to have your dialect if you haven't shared it with us already, or just you know, investigate what's the kind of rich stuff that we've got that we can share back with communities. I am going to stop sharing and hand back to Victoria.